Comments from the audience. Comments from the audience. Anyway, thank you very much for coming today. Thank you, folks, for coming in person, and thank you, people who are joining us online. Thank you for being with us that way as well. Just a little bit of housekeeping. You folks who are online, we're going to be muting your mics, so any noise in the background from where you are is not going to disturb other people. Our speaker will take questions at the end of this presentation, so please save your questions for then. We will ask the audience to contribute, and we'll ask the presenter to repeat the question so it can be heard both here and online. And you folks who are online, please use the chat feature to ask your questions. We have an announcement. I'm going to ask Tim to say the word.
Yes, real quick. So our two members of our audience tonight, Bob and Sharon McMahon, sadly are leaving us. They're moving up to Connecticut, and they've been instrumental. Both of them have volunteered at Waterloo, but Bob in particular has been very instrumental in the development of the Morris Canal Greenway out in Warren County. Lots and lots of work, and we are going to miss him terribly, miss them both terribly. So good luck to Bob and Sharon.
Thank you, Ted.
Thank you. Okay, just some words before we start our presentation. Some news and updates, and we sent out the annual appeal just recently. So I want to thank everybody who has made a donation. Thank you so much for your help. And for those who haven't yet, we'd appreciate hearing from you. We really appreciate the public support. We need that public support as a nonprofit. So thank you very much for your generosity. Volunteering. We've got all kinds of things.
There's a great link with the alarm going off. The alarm.
All right, we had a little alarm going off in the parking lot, so sorry about that. Okay, a little levity. And we'll get back on track. So we've had a wonderful season of volunteering at Waterloo. Our volunteer coordinator, Bobby Egan. Bobby, thank you so much for all that you did this year. He managed to staff every day that we were open, and we were able to do programming all the way into the end of October. So an excellent turnout. But to make that possible, we need volunteers. So many of you who sent in your return slips with the appeal checked off, be interested in volunteering, and so we'll be contacting you. And you folks here, please consider helping us at Waterloo, or next year possibly at the walk site at Wharton. And a very exciting challenge for us to take on. It doesn't take a genius to do this. It's fun. It's very often we invent it as we go along, and we meet a lot of interesting people. And but most important, we have a really good time doing it. So considering if Bobby gives you a call or you see her at one of our events, please consider joining us and volunteering for some of our events. News just occurring just recently. Many of you heard me talking about Bob Gollar's new book, Disappearing Act: The Abandonment of the Morris Canal. And so it's been a long time in the making. And so, and Bob hasn't been well. He really hasn't been well, but he's been soldiering on, and now he's almost to the point where we're going to be taking it to the printer. There's a copy of the book on the back table. Please take a look. It's really, really great. And so if you're going to be interested in buying a copy, please let us know. We'll put you on a list. We'll be working on having the interface with the fabricator soon. And so probably not for Christmas, but soon we should be able to have copies for you to buy. Let's see what else. Our new office and archive space is really coming along. We mentioned that recently, and so this is a new venture for us. and especially our archives is really coming together. And a lot of that has to do with John Breitow, who has really been working on the archives and bringing it together like it has never been organized before. How many folks go on our website? See some hands up there. How many people have gone and checked out the archival section of the website? Okay, a couple of hands going up there. Okay, well, this is really, really great. There are actually a couple of thousand entries on there now. And so you can actually go on the website and click the archive pull down menu and actually get into our archives and search for different topics. And many of those entries have got pictures attached. And so you may not be a skilled searcher or a researcher, but typing in search topics and then finding what you get can be very interesting. So I encourage you to give that a try, and that's going to grow and grow and grow as more entries are included. Projects, things that we've been doing. It's been a busy, exciting year. Many important greenway projects. Probably the most interesting one has been the lock restoration, the lock tenders and lock tenders house and lock at Wharton. And so it's coming along. I know that we expected it to be long done by now, but it's still not quite done. It's a very complicated project. The house will be done very soon, but the lock mechanisms to actually make it operate are still an issue. They have not been brought to the site yet. So stay tuned. And so we're really hoping that we will be able to be there and be doing events next summer, and probably, hopefully, starting with Pathways of History the first weekend in May. Really hoping to try to get that organized and make that happen. So, but that's going to take those volunteers, remember, please. Other greenway projects. Canal Society is managing and funding interpretive sign projects in Powerville, in Dover, in Montville, at Dorsey's Pond, and also in Newark. We've been working with the town of Wharton, and so there are good news and bad news with that. Our historic assets like the Yards Bridge and the blast furnace site and the railroad trestle and the inclined plane are artifacts that are going to be saved and will be part of our Greenway tour. Unfortunately, things that are going to be lost, a developer has bought two lots that contained many of the historic remains of the ironworks, and much of that is being demolished, including the Eston House, one structure that we hoped might be saved, but it's being torn down. It's happening. It started happening today, and so we're well. What you do when those things are happening, you try to make the best of it. So now it's a very, very interesting building, and now we're going to see how it's made as they take it apart. Also, the Putin Ironworks register nomination is also in the process and should be going to be adjudicated early next year. DNR Canal, the Canal Society participated in funding 3 major projects of restoration on the DNR Canal last year. Sales, our speaker, this has got some very great, interesting books back there. Please consider buying them while he's here, and you have them, and you have the author himself here is to sign books. Okay, do we have any announcements? Bill McKelvey?
Boy,
My goodness, this is the first time. Any other announcements? Hearing none then. All right, I would like to introduce Vince Hydra, our speaker. We've heard from him online once before. And so I know he's going to give us a marvelous presentation. And so Vince, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Joe. I titled this presentation a pictorial survey of the Lehigh Navigation. If we were going to do a history of it, we'd be here for a couple days. So I found some of the most interesting slides I could to show tonight. Well, I guess it's not working now. So next slide, please. So the Lehigh River early on was recognized by the government of Pennsylvania as being very important to the economy for transporting goods, mainly goods that were going from the Wyoming Valley, Wilkes-Barre area down the Susquehanna to Baltimore. They wanted to divert those goods to Philadelphia, or at least some of those goods. Next slide, please. So in order to do that, initially they developed two roads connecting the Lehigh with the Susquehanna from the mouth of the Nesquehoning Creek to a location near Berwick on the Susquehanna. Now, the Nesquehoning Creek empties into the Lehigh 1 mile above Mock Chunk, which is now Jim Thorpe. And that location was called Lausanne after 1806. And the first road over that area was an Evan Owen Road in 1790, and that was replaced by the Lehigh and Susquehanna Turnpike in 1806. Next slide, please. And this is a 1791 map of that part of Pennsylvania. If you click so I can see the next slide. Not coming up. Okay, there. So just to give you an idea where things are, that's where Easton is. Go ahead again. And Allentown, go ahead again. Not going, huh? Okay, there's Lehigh Water Gap. Please keep going. And the mouth of the Nesquehoning Creek, and go ahead again. And there you can see the road that went up to Berwick from the mouth of Nesquehoning Creek. And that mouth of the Nesquehoning Creek would become the head of the original Lehigh Canal. Go ahead again. And that's where Mock Chunk would later be settled, which is now the town of Jim Thorpe. Now, above the mouth of the Nesquehoning Creek, the Lehigh was not navigable before 1822 due to this little section of the river, which was called the Hetcheltooth Falls. And early on, the government of Pennsylvania was paying people to remove obstacles from the Lehigh. And a man actually would build cofferdams around these rocks and build fires in them and then release the water into the rocks to try to split them. But it didn't work. It just caused the problem to be moved elsewhere on the river. It wasn't until Josiah White came and worked on the river that he said, no, that's the wrong thing to do. You need to raise the water above the obstacles. And so where did that word Hetcheltooth come from? It comes from the hatchel, which is a device for combing iron teeth for cleansing flax or hemp from the toe. And that was called that. The river section was called that there because anytime a boat would try to go over those rocks, it would just tear the boat to shreds. So everything that happened in the Lehigh region happened because Philip Ginder discovered coal on Sharp Mountain in 1791, and that's now present-day Summit Hill. It's 9 miles west of Jim Thorpe. And this is from the 1792 Redding Howell map. Now, he was one of the first surveyors to survey the Lehigh River. And he was a great map maker too. And this shows Ginder's discovery, which is now Summit Hill. And he took some of that coal to Jacob Weiss, who lived on the Lehigh at present-day Weisport. And they were able to prove that it burned. And just Jacob Weiss sent that coal to Philadelphia. And within a year, the Lehigh Coal Mine Company was formed. Now, the Lehigh Coal Mine Company included people such as John Nicholson and Tench Cox. And the Lehigh Coal Mine Company was just a joint stock company. They mined some coal at Summit Hill, not a whole lot. And it was later absorbed by the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company, which was around for a long time. And the Lehigh Coal Mine Company, because they were not able to spend much time on site, they all lived in Philadelphia. They were leasing the coal lands out. And these three men, Charles Miner, Jacob Sist, and Isaac Chapman, they took a lease of the property in late 1813. And just in time, because the War of 1812 was causing a fuel shortage in Philadelphia. And so these men were able to get some coal down the Lehigh River. It was a little too early for it to become a commercial success, and people were reluctant to change from burning wood to burning coal. But they were able to get some arcs down the Lehigh River. And there's one famous trip that was made in August of 1814, where they were at Lausanne. They built some rafts, some arcs to ship some coal down the river, and they were waiting for a freshet, which I find strange because anybody that lived along the Lehigh back then knew that in August it was low water level. You weren't likely to get a freshet. And so my belief is they were praying for a freshet, and they actually got one. And so they were able to get some coal down to Philadelphia. And you know, I had read about that all my whole life about this arc trip, and I always wondered where did the coal arcs go? So they would go down the Lehigh to Easton, and then they would go down the Delaware River to Philadelphia. But where did they go in Philadelphia? And I finally tracked it down to this location, which was Pegg's Run. They would go in at the mouth of Pegg's Run. And this 1797 map shows Pegg's Run there. And the reason I believe that was because the coal went to this arc yard called Stellwagen and Knight. And that was only about 2 blocks from the mouth of that river. So that that creek now is Willow Street. It was actually culverted and paved over. And you could see that you could get a boat up Pegg's Run because this sketch from a book on the Annals of Philadelphia shows them wintering a sloop in the mouth of Pegg's Run. And by 1830, they had paved over Pegg's Run, and you could see that the LC&N continued to have an arc yard there at the on the Delaware. Now, once the Lehigh Canal was built, the canal boats only went as far as Bristol down the Delaware Canal, and then they were towed from Bristol by tugboats to different places on the Delaware River where the LC&N had coal yards. And so the region really wasn't developed until Josiah White and Erskine Hazard came in 1818. And they to step back a little bit, they bought some of that coal that made it from that 1814 arc trip down the Lehigh. And at the Falls of the Schuylkill, where they had a wire mill, they learned that by accident that the real way to burn anthracite coal was you had to have a draft underneath the fire. Wood and soft coal requires a draft across the fire. Anthracite coal, you have to have the draft from underneath. And they liked anthracite, and they decided that they were going to take a chance and develop the Lehigh region. So they came in 1818, and they started developing the Lehigh River from the mouth of the Nesquehoning Creek downward. At first, they started using wing dams and channels based upon low water level at Lausanne. Well, after they had spent all the time and money doing that, they had a really low weather rain period, and they learned that the Lehigh was still too low, so they had to give up that idea. And then they built descending navigation using a special type of water impounding dam called a bear trap. And they called them a bear trap because they were testing them on the Mock Chunk Creek in Mock Chunk. And if anybody came by and asked what they were doing, they said they were testing bear traps because they didn't want anybody to know what they were working on. So there's a working model of a bear trap in the Mock Chunk Museum in Jim Thorpe. And basically, you would have a train of coal arcs that would come down up to a lock, and the lock would hold back water. And so the lead man on the arc would jump off, and he would work that lever, which would lower the gates and let the water through, and the canal boat or the arcs would start going through the lock. He would jump back on and ride down to the next lock and do the same thing. And so there were 12 of these dams between Mock Chunk and the Lehigh Gap. And at the last lock, he would get off the train of arcs, and he would walk back to Mock Chunk, resetting all of these dams so that they would start holding back water for another day. And so these dams releasing this water would cause enough water from the Lehigh Gap to Easton that they could carry the arcs all the way to Easton. And this shows them going through one of these bear trap locks and dam arrangements. Now, this is the site in Jim Thorpe today where they tested those bear traps, and it's the Mock Chunk Opera House. If you ever get a chance to visit the town of Jim Thorpe, that is the site of where they tested those bear traps. Okay, so they ended up a couple of years later extending the bear trap navigation further up from Mauch Chunk. And the reason was they needed to tap the forests on the upper Lehigh region. And to do that, they had to be able to get the wood down to Mauch Chunk. Otherwise, the Hetcheltooth Rapids would tear up the wood. And so they built a bear trap at Hetcheltooth, and they also constructed one at Rockport, which is where all the lumbering operations took place. And this is right now at Hetcheltooth, there's remains of the bear trap are still visible under the water there. And this was taken by a friend of mine. This is a map from 1826. It was a watercolor map drawn by Solomon Roberts, who was a nephew of Josiah White. And he painted this in 1836 and gave it to Josiah's daughter. And Solomon Roberts later went on to be an engineer on the Portage Railroad, the Allegheny Portage Railroad. But I like it because it shows the road where coal came down from the mines, and it shows the bear trap dam and lock on the river. So in 1827, the LC&N, Josiah White, they built their first railroad, which was the Mauch Chunk Gravity Railroad, later to be known as the Switchback. And that allowed them to bring a lot more coal to the river. And that railroad, they used mules to return the empties back to the mines. And the mules would ride down they would ride down with the loaded coal cars to the river and then carry the cars back to the mines. And I have a book back there on the Switchback Railroad if you're interested. So an artist came to Mauch Chunk in 1832. His name was Carl Bodmer. He came with Prince Maximilian of Weed, and he painted this famous watercolor painting of the coal chute at Mauch Chunk. And this coal chute is at the termination of the Gravity Railroad. And I'm also showing here the Mansion House Hotel, which is a hotel that was built in 1823 to bring tourists to Mauch Chunk. So tourists came to the town as early as 1823, 1824 to visit the town. And then they also started riding the Switchback Railroad when it was built. Now, what's interesting is this is 1832, and there's still Durham boats there. Martha Capwell pointed that out to me, that those are Durham boats. They're not canal boats, but the canal was finished in 1829. So why is that? Well, we'll talk about that. So the two-way slack water navigation on the original Lehigh Canal from Mauch Chunk to Easton was completed in 1829, but the Delaware Canal was not. So they couldn't use the canal boats on the Lehigh Canal at that time. They had to wait until the Delaware Canal was finished. So they kept using those Durham boats and arcs to carry the coal down the river. So this is where the original ascending and descending two-way canal system, completed in 1829, ran from Mauch Chunk all the way to Easton. And one of the engineers on the Lehigh Canal was a man named Canvas White. You're probably familiar with him. He was involved with the Erie Canal, and a lot of other construction projects around the country. Interestingly enough, we found out that he left some children behind. He left a daughter who married one of the coal operators at Summit Hill. Her name was Ophelia. And he left a son, Charles L. White, who was a coal contractor for the LC&N. He also went to California during the gold rush on the boat called the Algoma. He came back to Mauch Chunk and worked on the Hacklebarney Tunnel and the Lehigh Canal. And I think you were on the hike with us when we looked at the Hacklebarney Tunnel.
Yeah, I was.
So the completion of the Delaware Canal in late 1832, early 1833 allowed the LC&N to begin using canal boats, two-way canal boats. They also completed the Room Run Railroad at that time, which was another gravity railroad that ran from Nesquehoning to Mauch Chunk. And that was the second feeder, second anthracite coal feeder to the Lehigh Navigation. First was the Mauch Chunk Railroad, second was the Room Run Railroad. Now, interestingly, the Room Run Railroad was designed by Josiah White, but it used stone blocks for sleepers instead of wood ties. Switchback used wood ties. And so there's a whole story there. And if you're interested in it, it's too much to go into here. But I have, that's, I go over that in my book on the Room Run Railroad, which is back there if you're interested. I have donated a copy to your library, and it's also available on Amazon if you don't want to get it here. So the completion of the Delaware Canal, they started advertising for men to not only boat coal down the canal, but to construct canal boats. And this ad, I believe, is one of the reasons that brought Asa Packard to Mauch Chunk, because he was a carpenter and he was looking for a different way to make a living. And this ad was run in 1832, and soon after, Asa Packard came to Mauch Chunk, and he began building canal boats and running canal boats himself. Now, in 1836, they constructed the first waylock below Mauch Chunk, and this there's remains of that. Very few remains actually below Jim Thorpe on the D&L trail. And the earliest superintendent at the waylock was a man named William Haitian Sayre. And he started working for the LCN in 1833, and his annual salary was $550, which was a really good salary back then. And his son, Robert Haitian, was an engineer on the switchback, and later he surveyed Asa Packard's railroad, which became the Lehigh Valley Railroad. And Robert's mansion is still standing in Bethlehem and is a bed and breakfast now. I wanted to put this map on because it shows the descending canal and some of the other things around there. So there's lock number 1, lower division, and there's the waylock. And there was an iron furnace right near the waylock where they did some of the earliest smelting of iron with anthracite coal in the late 1830s. They weren't able to beat out Pottsville for the prize for doing that, but they did smelt a lot of anthracite coal there. And that later became a power plant at the location. And I have pictures of that. And the Sayres actually lived in a house right near the waylock. And it was a 2-story single room house. And the Sayres lived on the bottom floor and another family lived on the top floor. Now, the upper division from Mauch Chunk up to Whitehaven was completed in 1838, and that was also a slackwater navigation system, kind of like the lower division. So in the case of a true canal, you would not have any slackwater pools, but the Lehigh Canal was a combination. It used not only canaling, but it used slackwater pools as well. And from Whitehaven to Stoddartsville, which is above Whitehaven up into the forests, they continued to use a descending only navigation using the Bearcraft locks. And the reason why they went to Stoddartsville, well, let me go forward here a little bit, and then I'll back up. So John Stoddard, who settled Stoddartsville, he was one of the few people, when Josiah White needed money, he was one of the few people that would give the fledgling LCNN any money. So the LCNN agreed then to construct the navigation from Whitehaven all the way up to Stoddartsville. And I was just looking at some of my research today, and that navigation stayed there. It was still there in 1874, although the LCNN was complaining that the lumbermen weren't paying tolls on the navigation. Now let me back up there. So anyway, you could see some of the railroad feeders into the upper division of the canal. You had the Ashley Plains, the Lehigh and Susquehanna Railroad that went to Wilkes-Barre. You had them feeding into the upper division at Whitehaven. And then at Rockport, where the initial logging operations for the LCNN took place, you had the Buck Mountain mines fed in there. And at Penn Haven, you had the Beaver Meadow and Hazleton railroads. Now, the engineer for the upper division was a man named Edwin Douglas. And he was hired by Josiah White primarily because he was the only engineer that would actually work on the navigation and work on the high locks. Josiah White was proposing such high locks for the upper division that no engineer believed that it could be done. Edwin Douglas was the only engineer that said that it could be done. And so Josiah White hired him. His annual salary was $4,000. It included the house and fuel, and his house was located right across from where Asa Packer's mansion still stands. And he stayed with the company until his death in 1859. And he did most of the engineering work for the Ashley Plains. So this is one of the high locks that's still standing, and this is located between Whitehaven and Tannery, and it's very easy to get to. There's another high lock, which is further down at Hickory Run, which is about 3 miles to walk to. So this one's a lot easier to get to. And this is a view of the Tannery Dam, which was a very high dam, 34 feet high. It was destroyed in the 1862 flood. And there are still some remains. I believe some of these, the ends of the dam are still standing there. Sometimes people see this image and think this is actually a picture of the flood, but this is actually what it looked like in operation. And you see all the lumber laying here from all the lumbering operations in the upper division of the canal. So if you're ever, I don't know if any of you ever hiked the DNL trail, but if you're at Rockport, if you see these tunnels right near the road, the Buck Mountain Railroad actually had inclined planes that ran down through those tunnels to get the coal down to the river. And it had to go through them because of the curvature in the road. And so they actually ran them through there. And there was a man named Asa Lansford Foster who was originally involved with the Buck Mountain Railroad. And he was completely financially wiped out in the flood of 1841. So these are the inclined planes at Penn Haven. And you can still go walk up them, although they're very much grown in now. So one side was for the Beaver Meadow Railroad, and one side was for the Hazleton Railroad. And I've been looking at this, trying to figure out what kind of inclined planes were these? Were these self-acting or were they steam operated? They were letting down planes because they were lowering loaded cars. They weren't lowering empties, they were lowering loaded cars. But the two cars that are so close together on that side doesn't look that could be like they could be self-acting inclined planes. It almost looks like they're steam driven or steam brake. I don't know. I just don't know enough about them. There isn't any real information on the construction of these inclined planes. But this photograph was taken when the planes were feeding into the railroad system rather than when they were feeding into the canal system. The feeders into the canal system were destroyed by the 1862 flood, and I'll talk about that later. And so I don't know what was in these buildings at the top, whether they were boiler houses or whether they were braking mechanisms like giant wooden fans that were used on the Carbondale Railroad. But they're huge. The remains of them are huge. And we took a hike up there. Now it's 30 years ago. I can't believe it. And it's a lot more grown in now. It's very, very difficult to get up there. And a lot of ruins up in that area too. And the view from the top is pretty incredible. And there's a cabin up there that was built one time by a doctor from Lansford, Pennsylvania, named Dr. Druckenmiller. And these are the remains of those break houses, is what I've been calling them. I'm not so sure that they were break houses, but they're very, very substantial structures that are still up there. If you go up there, you have to be careful though, because there's a rod and gun club that owns property right up close to that. And the people that are in the Rod and Gun Club are Larry, Darrell, and Darrell. So you want to be careful. In 1841, in January, the Lehigh Navigation was completely destroyed. Only 3 years after the upper division was put into place. And what happened is something that's fairly common on the Lehigh and Delaware rivers is that you have a fall, an autumn, where the water level drops really low and then it freezes. And then you have these giant ice dams that form because ice may be a solid, but it still moves. And then you have a January thaw and January rain. And that's what happened in 1841. It totally destroyed the navigation. They didn't have any money to repair the navigation. They had to mortgage all their property for the first time. And the size of the loan and the interest payments on those loans required them to radically increase production. And that's what made them move from the Sharp Mountain, Summit Hill mines into the Panther Valley to increase production. And they had to build gravity railroads into the Panther Creek Valley. There was no way to get the coal to market. And that was the only thing they could do was mortgage their property. So what happened? So in these floods, Josiah White was always quick to observe and to study the damage that was done. And then the company would invest money to reinforce those areas where the navigation failed. And the primary cause for the 1841 flood was that the water overtopped the guard banks. There were, in the upper division, there was earthen dams that were on the ends of the dams. And when water overtops an earthen dam, that's catastrophic, and that's what happened. And so once the water overtopped the guard banks, then the dams failed. And following the 1841, the LCNN substantially raised these guard banks. In fact, they replaced them a lot of time with stone banks. Well, this is Josiah White. He was definitely a canal man. He was not in favor of railroads, but this really broke his heart, this January flood. And in late January, early February, he went with Edwin Douglas, and they walked the entire distance of the canal in slogging wet weather. And he was 60 years old at the time. It nearly broke his heart, the damage that was done. And he kept a record, and you could view these books at the Canal Museum in Easton. So in my years of studying the Lehigh Navigation Company and the Lehigh, I asked myself a question like, well, what year did the floods occur? After looking at all these years, the real question is, what year didn't they happen? Despite their efforts to strengthen the navigation after each flood, every successive flood was considered worse than the one before it. It's really sad. In fact, it makes me wonder, and this is something I want to do eventually, is figure out whether the Lehigh Canal ever made a profit or whether it was just a cost, because the money that they had to expend on repairing these floods was incredible. So in 1846, in order to increase production, they completed the backtrack to the mines. So that was now, it was a return and backtrack going to the mines, and it allowed them to expand into the Panther Creek Valley. And this return track used those two inclined planes, one at Mount Pisgah and one in Summit Hill. And this is a little view showing where that railroad went. So you can see the town of Mauch Chunk and the Lehigh River and Canal, the original gravity railroad, and then the backtrack with its inclined planes, and then the coal chutes on the river. And so the LCNN was able to radically expand production of coal and start to pay off some of their debts. In fact, they were so in debt in the 1840s that the interest on their loans they couldn't pay with money; they actually had to pay with coal. And these are some of these nice views of the chutes that were on the Lehigh River. And we're looking south west here, and I'm highlighting the Mansion House Hotel again because there's a bridge across the river at that point that failed during each of these floods. And this is a close-up of that view showing some of the canal boats waiting to be loaded. Now, this photo was taken by the photographer backing up a little bit so that you could see there were also coal docks on the east side of the river across from the west side chutes. And they basically were for the termination of the Beaver Meadow Railroad and bringing coal from the middle coal region, Buck Mountain mines, Hazleton mines, Spring Mountain mines. So in the 1830s, the Beaver Meadow Railroad and Coal Company decided to build a railroad down through the Lehigh Valley. In fact, they were planning on building this railroad all the way to Easton. And the LCNN was able to talk them into terminating at Perryville below Mauch Chunk, which they did. But the Perryville location was destroyed during the 1841 flood, so they terminated at East Mauch Chunk then. And those chutes stayed in place until 1887. And this is another view of that area on the east side. Now, this is in 1860, and again, I put this on here so you could see some of the chute arrangements. There's the Lehigh Canal, the Mauch Chunk chutes, the East Mauch Chunk chute, and there's where the Room Run Railroad brought coal down from Nesquehoning mines, from the Room Run mines, which eventually became known as the Nesquehoning mines. So in June of 1862, there was another big flood. There had been ones before that, and we don't have the time to go into all of them, but it had a different cause than the 1841 flood. They had raised the guard banks sufficiently, and so there was no water flow over the guard banks, but the dams on tributary streams feeding the upper Lehigh, those dams broke. And the big problem in the upper division was the clear cutting of all the forests up there. They lost their watershed capability. And so these tributary dams failed and raised the water level higher than it had ever been raised in the Lehigh, but still everything held. But lumber booms in the Lehigh River at Whitehaven broke. And that's what those lumber stacks looked like back then. There's hardly any water there. And when those booms broke, they sent down between 200 and 300,000, basically battering rams, pouring down the Lehigh River. And those battering rams just pummeled the guard banks, pummeled the dams. And so each of these dams started failing. And as they failed, they would add just more wood and more water to the torrent. So in that flood, the Lehigh rose 27 feet above its normal water level, 10 feet higher than during 1841. And between 200 and 300 people lost their lives in that flood. And the navigation repair was hampered by basically the Civil War conscription pulling people away from the area. And a loose canal boat struck the second floor of the Mansion House Hotel. And so you could see how high the water had gotten at that flood. But Asa Packer, he had been living on Susquehanna Street. His mansion was completed the year before. Otherwise, he would have been flooded out, but he moved into his mansion just in time to avoid getting flooded out. And that mansion is still standing if you haven't had a chance to tour it. In fact, if you had a chance to tour it, they tell you stuff, and I hate saying this because I get in trouble for this, but they tell you stuff in the tours that's not quite true. There's this whole myth about Mary Packer Cummings getting divorced, and she was never divorced, and there's just a whole story around that that has absolutely no basis in fact. And I researched that, and I wrote about that in a book, trying to show the truth behind the Packer family and how they lived. Well, following the 1862 flood, the LCN abandoned the upper section of the canal, and they replaced it with a railroad. It became part of the Lehigh and Susquehanna Railroad, which ran from Wilkes-Barre all the way to Easton when it was completed. And that railroad permitted the LCN to get rid of its switchback gravity railroad and its room-run gravity railroad and replace them with locomotive railroads. And this is showing them tearing down those switchback chutes on the Lehigh River. And they built some new loading docks up above Mock Chunk at a location that would come to be known as Coalport. And we're looking up the river now at those loading docks, and the outlet lock for the basin is there, and as well as the little village of Coalport. Now, my ancestors came over around 1914 to the United States. There were two cousins, George and Michael Hydra, and Michael settled in Nesquehoning. George settled at Coalport, and Ellis Island converted the name Hydra into Hydro. They said it's not Hydra anymore, it's Hydro now. Which is interesting because I had to do some work in Canada at one time. When I was checking into the hotel, they looked at me and said, "Do you work for Ontario Hydro?" I'm like, no, that's just my name. Hydro is my name. And this is a nice view showing those Coalport loading docks as well as the little village of Coalport there. And the towpath that you see on this arrow, that's still accessible. In fact, we took a hike a year or so ago with the DNL, and we walked down partway down that towpath. And a lock is accessible above that, and it's lock number 2 of the upper division. And that one is a lock that was constructed by Edwin Douglas. And I didn't believe that at first. Lance Smith had told me that, and I didn't believe it at first until I researched it and found some maps that showed that that was something that was built by Edwin Douglas before the flood of 1862. It survived the flood of 1862, and it's still standing there. And it's a beautiful lock, beautiful work. I just love looking at that kind of stonework. Well, it was only 7 years later when there was another big flood. And this time it washed out this bridge that had been built to access the Mansion House Hotel. And John Leisenring, who was a previous contractor, he took over as superintendent of engineer from Edwin Douglas. He superintended in response to the flood. And by then, Mock Chunk flooding problems were not just the Lehigh River, they were also the Mock Chunk Creek, which the town was built basically over the top of that creek. That started to show itself. So here's another view of the Mansion House Hotel, and there's the Mansion House Bridge. And that got washed away in the 1869 flood and was rebuilt because the Lehigh Valley Railroad depot was on the other side of that bridge. And so the Lehigh Valley Railroad would always chip in to rebuild the bridge. This is a beautiful shot showing that bridge leading up to the hotel. And there's the miter gates for lock number 1 of the lower division. And that part of the Mansion House Hotel is still standing in Jim Thorpe. It's now Highland Beverage. The rest of that structure is all gone, unfortunately. And there's where the Lehigh Valley Railroad depot was located. And there you can see the bridge is gone. And this is one of the earliest stereo views taken of the town of Mock Chunk by a photographer named Joseph Brown. And there again, you can see basically the bridge is gone. And there's lock number 1 of the lower division. And there's a view, again, showing after the 1869 flood, showing the lock and the Mansion House Bridge Pier. Well, some famous people visited the town. And in 1886, Louis Comfort Tiffany came to town on a converted canal scow. And he brought with him his fiancée, who was the daughter of Lafayette College dean, and a chaperone, and some other people. And they tied up at lock number 4 and stayed the night, and then came up through town, and they kept the logbook. And you could read that logbook at the Canal Museum. And there's a picture of the boat. It was called the Molly Polly Chunker. And they tied up at lock number 4 and took a bunch of pictures. And they're in the red Lehigh and Delaware Canal book if you want to see more of these photographs. And they're really, really interesting pictures. Especially this one intrigues me so much because the house they lived in was really, really tiny. And there's a bunch of kids there. And they're really, they really look happy. I'm kind of surprised. And there's I didn't have a copy of the picture, but there's a picture they took of their goat too. And that lock, this is what it looks like today. You can see there's a structure up there. It's an observation deck that they built. And you really get a great view from that. It's about, if you want to walk from Weisport, it's about 3 miles. And if you walk from Jim Thorpe, it's about 2 miles. And there's a view of the canal towpath leading towards Jim Thorpe. And I love this photograph here showing, I don't know if they call that riprap or not, but the stones are fitted into the bed of the towpath here because this is one of the wasteways where water would flow over the towpath whenever it was too high. So in 1892, the electric trolley came to Mock Chunk, and they decided to power it using electricity generated in a hydroelectric plant on the Lehigh River. And they built that on the dam in the lock house of lock number 1 of the upper division. That was completed in August 1893. And there's the Central Railroad shops for New Jersey. Now they ended up leasing, in the early 1870s, the Central Railroad began leasing the LC&N's Lehigh and Susquehanna Railroad. And they leased that pretty much until the end of the corporation. And I don't think they ever really fully paid their rental fees. And the rental fees were ridiculous. I don't know how anybody could ever make a profit if they would have paid them. And there were always lawsuits around about that. But anyway, knowing the Lehigh River and knowing the conditions on the Lehigh River, it's surprising that anybody would build a hydroelectric plant at least this far up north. And so in December of 1893, they had to shut down the trolley because the water was freezing in the river and in the lock house. And so they couldn't run the turbines. And it's like, I don't know, it just doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, they eventually built a steam plant west of Mauch Chunk in order to be able to keep the trolley running during wintertime. Well, the wintertime wouldn't be the only problem, as we'll see later. And this water turbine, you can see at the Mauch Chunk Museum, John Drury, the owner of the museum, had it pulled out of the river. And it's pretty interesting. There were 2 turbines there at one time. And it must have been dislodged during one of the many floods and left there. Two years later, the Mauch Chunk Power Company decided that they had a steam plant in Mauch Chunk for generating electricity for the town lighting, which the people replaced the gas lighting with the electric lighting. And that went into operation in April of that year. That summer, guess what?
Yeah.
The water was too low in the river to run either the electric trolley or the electric light plant. Okay. And that was a very, very common thing. And so they ended up having to build a backup steam plant. And that electric plant was built over the top of what had been the iron furnace. And it was eventually destroyed by fire. And at that point in time, Mauch Chunk connected to Lehigh Navigation Electric, which later became Pennsylvania Power and Light. And this is looking down from Flagstaff. And you could see the remains of the Waylock and the remains of the hydroelectric plant, which in the 1840s and late 1830s was the furnace used for smelting iron with anthracite coal. And the remains of that are still there. They're not as clear as when this picture was taken, but they're still, you can still see where the turbine sat and where the weirs were for water flow. So early 1900s, the stage is set for the demise of the canal by extreme weather conditions. In the summertime of 1901, the drought was so bad that the dams on the Nesquehoning Creek were dry completely. The Hotto Dam and the Greenwood dams were completely dry, and they provided water to the mines for running their steam boilers. So the mines had to shut down. Well, and in August of that year, then on top of the drought, you get severe floods. And guess what? You know what happens when the ground gets hard from a drought, and then you have a flood on top of it. It's really bad. But the Mansion House Bridge held. And in February, the U.S. Weather Bureau sent telegrams saying that conditions were ripe for a warm weather, and the conditions were set to have something happen exactly like happened in 1841, where you had an ice freshet. And it turned out it did. It happened. It swept Pennsylvania, carrying death and destruction everywhere. The Lehigh Valley flooded end to end, bridges washed away, and traffic suspended. Whitesport, again, completely inundated. Now, some of the consequences of this were that the culm dams on the Nesquehoning Creek, which were built to keep coal dirt from flowing into the Lehigh, they broke and just flooded the canal above Mauch Chunk with coal dirt. And they would have to dredge the Lehigh from then on. There were lawsuits brought by the Lehigh Valley Railroad and lawsuits brought by the Central Railroad of New Jersey as well. And this shows you the location of those culm dams. And one of those dams, I lived kind of just basically above that dam on Catawissa Street, and I was always hanging around that dam. I never realized what it was for until I found this map. And here's some of the photographs from the 1902 flood, and you could see the big ice chunks in the river there. And there's the Mansion House Bridge right before it went. And it surprises me how close people will stand when there's danger. And there she is, she's gone. And there's the Mansion House Hotel, but the Mansion House Hotel would actually get water level up to about there in that flood. And this is after the flood, when people, I guess, were trying to get their belongings out of the hotel. Now, the Mansion House Hotel, tourists used that and came to town and used that until 1895. And after 1895, there was no more tourist traffic there. It was only used for like monthly boarders. And there you could see again the last of the bridge, and that bridge would not be rebuilt. That was the end of it. So the Lehigh Valley Railroad depot, which is across from that bridge, ended up getting moved upstream a couple hundred feet because the Lehigh Valley Railroad had no reason to rebuild the bridge. But we got a bridge there just recently. The DNL finished the pedestrian bridge, and it connects the two sections of the DNL trail. So you can basically, if you really want to, you can walk from Whitehaven all the way to Easton. Although there's a section that's near Allentown that's not quite finished, but this bridge just really changed the way the whole trail is accessed, and it's a beautiful, beautiful structure. We're so happy with it. And up at Glenanoco, which is the waterfalls above Mock Chunk, there the Central Railroad Bridge was washed out as well, and you could see the famous Juanita Hotel behind the bridge. But that bridge was rebuilt. And this is the bridge at Easton, which in that flood as well. So in 1907, trying to reduce costs because the canal was a very expensive proposition, they decided to replace the mules with an electric mule. And you could see a train of canal boats being pulled along here. And I show the Packerton's shops of the Lehigh Valley Railroad just for comparison. But that didn't really work out. It was within a year, the project was scrapped. It was too expensive. And the whole point was to speed up the passage of canal boats. But the speed was so high that it actually caused the banks of the canal to wash out. And these are the cement footers for the guardrail that ran along the canal right around lock number 4. So I mentioned before all the coal dirt that went into the canal. There were dredges in operation on that river up until the canal was completely shut down. And they ended up supplying the the New Jersey zinc plant at Palmerton. They supplied them with these fines that they burned in their boilers. And at the Coalport loading docks, they built a cleaning plant there as well. In 1921, the canal was basically on the point of shutting down, at least as far as Mock Chunk. So this man named Edward Mulhern, he put together this trip of veteran canal boatmen, and they went in a canal boat from Mock Chunk all the way down to Bristol and back, just to kind of celebrate the canal and the boatmen who had operated on the canal. And in that time period is when the canal was so clogged with coal dirt in the Mock Chunk area, and the Coalport loading docks were falling apart. They decided to shut down the canal at that point and move the coal docks to Laurie Station, which is near Northampton. And they started transferring the coal from railroads to the canal boats at that point in that year. And these are some of the pictures of that loading station. And you could view these too in that red book on the Delaware and Lehigh canals. Well, in 1933, April, again, I'm picking out certain years, mainly because there were some photographs available. The Lehigh River, in April, they had a warning that there could be flooding, but it never happened. But in August, it did. And this time, the Mock Chunk Creek really caused problems in this town. And this is a picture of that opera house that I showed you. And there's the street in front of it turned into a river. And basically what would happen is, because the creek runs out of the town, when you had flooding, debris would get clogged in the upper parts of the creek and break out and cause the water to flow down the streets. And that year brought, it stopped working, so you can click. That year brought Francis Walter, a U.S. congressman. That brought him to Mock Chunk. And he started getting involved with Lehigh River flood control. And I have a couple slides in here showing what the condition of the canal looked like back in those later years. The history of the canal at that point on further is, I haven't really studied so much, and I don't have so many pictures available. But in the 1940s, as part of the Work Projects Administration, Jack Delano took photographs of Mock Chunk, and this is a photograph of that upper division dam number 1, with the lock that had once held the a turbine for the electric trolley. And in 1947, we had another flood, and this is flooded out Weissport. And finally, in March of 1941, Francis Walter, he proposed some major flood control work on the Lehigh River, and that ended up becoming the Francis Walter Dam, which was placed in service in 1961. So it's the final history is not too nice. They continued dredging until the canal was completely shut down, and then the LCN began selling properties off, and Easton Hemore donated some money, and they were able to restore parts of the old canal. And then the LCN, which was starting to break up, they started transferring all of their properties into 2 companies, the Northeast Land Company and the Blue Ridge Real Estate Company. And they started selling off canal properties as well. And then in 1979, it was designated a National Recreation Trail. So a side note, the Mock Chunk Watershed Dam was completed in 1972, just as Hurricane Agnes came rolling through. The town didn't flood for the first time, and that led, within a decade, we started having people with money moving into town, artists coming in and restoring the town. And so we had a real revival since then. Now, Josiah White did not like railroads. He was a canal man. And in 1830, he got into a big argument with this man, John L. Sullivan, in the newspapers. There was a big battle of words as to which was better, the railroad or the canal. Well, Josiah White had all these calculations showing that the canal was the cheaper solution to transporting goods. But that was in 1830, before any of the floods. I don't think if you factored in the cost of any of those floods, you would certainly not be able to compete with the railroad. But, and he said this, our company have no reason to dislike railroads. Ours has undoubtedly saved $50,000 already, but by our canal, we know that we now go an equal distance at 1/4 the cost of the railroad. But a canal cannot be made to the mine, so we resort to the next best thing. He didn't win the argument in the newspapers, but he had a pastoral vision of the Lehigh Canal and any kind of actual construction. He was kind of in league with Thomas Jefferson in that way, that things should be slow and natural and in harmony with nature. And I love this view of the canal, which kind of shows that that's Josiah White's vision. But speaking of pastoral visions and idyllic visions, several years ago, my wife and I went to London, and a friend of ours had said, if you go to London, you've got to go to Camden Town on a market day. It's a madhouse. And I was like getting freaked out by all the people. And so I kind of missed the sign up there that said Camden Lock. But when we were on top of the bridge, I looked down and there's a canal boat loading up with people. So we get down and we go in there and they take us out into the countryside on the canal. It was just incredible. And I was talking with the tour guide and telling him that we lived there near the Lehigh Canal. And he was telling me like all these canals that they still have in England. It was just incredible. And people living in the canal boats, and I just loved it. It was just very relaxing and kind of a refreshment from the market town. And we have something like that in Pennsylvania. We have a restored section at Easton, and you can ride a canal boat, and it's pulled by mules. And probably some of you have already done that. So if you ever get a chance, do that. And you can tour a lock tender's house and see a lock operation. With that, I conclude my talk. And if you have any questions, I'll answer them now. But otherwise, if anybody that's online wants to take a screenshot of this, you can contact me at email addresses. I'm also on Facebook. To answer them as well.
I'm curious about the bear trap. You said it was one way
What did they do with the boats once they went?
Good question. So the boats were taken down to Philadelphia and torn apart and the wood sold. And the metal was brought back to Mauch Chunk. They would walk or ride the parts back, all the metal parts, they would walk back to Mauch Chunk. In fact, Josiah White got into a big argument one time with the managers in Philadelphia because they weren't getting the parts back fast enough to keep building the coal arcs. That's a really good question. I forgot about saying that. Yes, sir.
How about the Durham boats? I assume the Durham boats were built down in Durham off of the, below East. How'd they get those boats up? All the way to Tim Ford.
Well, once the ascending navigation was built, they could bring them up that way. And so, like I said, that was completed in 1829. So they could get them up that way. But the arcs themselves were built in Mauch Chunk from lumber brought down from Rockport.
But if they
Yes,
were
sir.
lightly loaded, they could probably go up the Delaware River if the Delaware Canal wasn't built. Would that be how they could get them up there?
I don't know. I'm not familiar with that at all. In fact, Martha was the first person to point out to me that those were Durham boats because we were trying to figure out how in the world they were able to build the Lehigh Canal and keep the bear traps still in operation. I still don't know. Me and Martha are working on that because the bear traps were built on the same side as the Lehigh Canal. And so how could you, and they still shipped coal those years. So they were using the bear traps. How do you do that and build the Lehigh Canal at the same time? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, they have some replicas at Washington Crossing State Park. They
Okay.
got like 2 or 3 Durham boats.
Oh, do they? Okay. That's good to know. Any other questions? Yes,
I
ma'am.
know the answer to this, but I think that our audience and the people out there at home might want to know what was that white circle with the black bullseye mean? It's on the little boat.
Well, if you know it, I don't know it. So please tell us because I don't know. That's an LCNN symbol, but I have no idea where it came from. So I would be.
Remember coal houses as a kid.
Yes. Yeah, that is an LCNN symbol. And Martha Capel Fox asked me that question a while ago. And I have no idea where that came from. I mean, I don't know who drew it or
We
whatever.
were out, I think it was a Mexican, and I bought a really neat little refrigerator now.
Yeah.
And it says old companies.
Old companies, yes, that was their logo at some point, but I don't know who designed it, or actually, I don't even know how old it is. So if anybody ever figures that out, please email me. Anything else?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Early in your program, you mentioned Canvas White.
Yes.
Canvas White was the chief engineer of the Delaware and Raritan Canal in New Jersey. He died just before the canal was completed, but he is buried in Princeton.
Okay, thank you. Yes. Yeah, I was surprised. Jerry Bastoni wrote for one of the very first proceedings of the Canal Museum. He wrote that Canvas White only had one son, Hugh, but we found enough evidence now that actually he had several sons and he had a daughter, and some of them he left in Mauch Chunk, which has surprised me. In fact, his house was right on Broadway, pretty close to the Opera House. Yes, sir.
I'm sure there's a lot of people who don't know the answer to this, but I didn't think of it until recently. Like the coal chutes on the Delaware and when the Mauch Canal started in Phillipsburg. That coal was coming in on the railroads, right? And why were they putting it into the canal roads? Why didn't the railroad just take it to New York City? Because it served it.
Well, and so same question, why did they build the coal port loading docks in the 1860s and transfer the coal to canal boats? Because canal transportation was cheaper than railroad transportation, and it was slower. But, and that's because of the accounting system they used. They had a funny way of accounting for costs on the canal, like the flood costs and all that. They weren't in there in the cost of the boating and if they would have been, that I don't think that would have happened. I think they would have just went with the railroad. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to mention, my grandfather worked for New Jersey Zinc. And just wanted to get their mind from New Jersey, and when they played out, they ended up in Palmerton. But he worked in New York City, So it's called New Jersey Zinc, and here the offices were in there getting in. The mines ended up in Palmer.
I worked at the zinc for 2 short months in 1974. Yes, hard job.
Well, this was
Very hard job.
alternative depression, so he was slow.
Yeah, was a very hard job. Yes, I would have stayed at it, but it was the big layoff in 1974. Yeah, but it was a tough job, dragging slag out of the furnaces and stuff like that. Yes, sir.
Most of the coal that was loaded from railroad cars into Morris Canal boats in Phillipsburg was for local delivery to coal yards along the canal.
Okay.
Some of it got to Jersey City, but most of it was local factories and coal yards.
That makes sense, but I did see an article in one of the annual reports talking about the cost per ton of coal in the canal boats, and it just seemed ridiculously low to me. And when I looked through, Anthony Breisky did a financial study of the canal, and he said they did all kinds of weird, probably would never be legal today, the counting methods they used, where they didn't include those canal repair costs, in the cost of the canal. Anything else?
Okay. Yep, online questions. First up, did the canal carry only coal or did it also carry agricultural products, building stone, iron
Yeah,
ore?
it carried everything. The coal was the biggest product, but it also carried people. There were packet boats that ran on the canal that carried people as well.
There was a question, you mentioned a J.L. Sullivan. Was that J.L. Sullivan also the CEO of Middlesex Canal, 1808-21?
That I'm not sure about. This was John Langdon Sullivan. It's quite possible, but I'm not sure. I don't know a whole lot about the man, other than his big fight with Josiah White.
And let's see, a couple more here. Did the coal finds that were dredged from the canal were they formed into briquettes for export, or was it just?
They were mainly taken to the zinc plant for their furnaces. The creating briquettes, actually it was proposed. They built a plant in Nesquehoning in the 1870s, but the Depression of 1870s put an end to that. They were eventually processed and produced in Lansford. They called them boulets at the time. But the whole problem with that was that you were creating a competition for the coal. And so I don't know how smart that was. It was good use for the fines, but it cut into their coal sales as well. But no, that was not carried on the canal other than to the zinc plant.
And last one, where's the Hatchet Tooth Rapid located?
It's located 3 miles above Jim Thorpe, 1 mile above Glenanoco, above the turnhole. And if you walk up there and look in the river, you can't miss it because the rocks are just huge.
Okay, that's it for the online question.
Anything else? Yes, sir.
So they completed the Lehigh before they finished the Delaware Canal.
Yes.
That was pretty gutsy. They're building a transportation system with no connection to major market, but they did it anyway.
They were very upset about that. In fact, Josiah White went to work and finished the Delaware Canal and at a minimal salary, just so that the LCN was always trying to get control of Delaware. In fact, I think they
Eventually they did, I believe.
yeah, I'm not sure about that. Or later on, maybe. I thought the Lehigh Valley had gotten control of it at one time too. The competitors for the LCN were always trying to get control of the Delaware as well. But the LCN was never happy about not.
That was always a troublesome connection.
Yes.
That was a state-built canal.
Yes.
The state of Pennsylvania built the canal, and it was badly built and underbuilt and.
Right. Yes, everything.
And then finally in 1831, the Morris Canal provides another.
Right,
outlet.
right.
Eventually, the only bit.
In fact, they would bring the Morris Canal boats would come up all the way to Mock Chunk, and they were given special preference at certain times for being filled up. And the other thing interesting that I found was that so Asa Packer built canal boats for the Lehigh Canal. He was also with his brother building canal boats for the Schuylkill Canal, and those boats could work not only on the canal but on the ocean too. Which well, why didn't they just do that for the Lehigh too? I never figured that out.
But then the Lehigh boats were bigger than the Morris boats.
Right.
So the more those can go up to the mount jump and load up, the Lehigh boats go back. Use the mark.
Standardization was not. Yeah.
You know,
Yep, I agree. Well, same thing with Josiah White with those stone blocks. You know, if you read my book on the River Run Railroad, why did Josiah White put stone blocks for the sills instead of wooden ties like he did in the switchback? Well, it was partly because of an argument with John L. Sullivan. Sullivan basically told him he built a switchback cheaply. So Josiah White was like, well, I'll show you, you know. But there were all kinds of problems with those stone blocks. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I think you said the bear trap blocks went like as far, was it Lehigh Gorge?
There was 12 of them from Mock Chunk to the Lehigh Gap. There was 2 below that, and then there was 2 above that, one at Hetcheltooth, one at Rockport, and then there was 2 or 3 up at Stoddardsville. I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I think there's remains of one at Stoddardsville, yeah.
I heard that.
So did they, could they get away with just like, you know, below the bear trap blocks? Was the Lehigh deep enough, or did they add wing dams or lesser
In the upper division?
improvements?
Well,
Well,
once,
I mean, like from Lehigh Gap to Easton.
oh, the flow of water from those 12 bear traps was enough to get a fresh. I forget how many inches they
Oh, so
were
that
fresh.
water would last all the way down
Yes,
to Easton?
yep.
Wow.
Yep, and it would take, I think it would take a day to get from Rockport down to or overnight. So at nighttime, the night before they were going to do a shipment from Mock Chunk, they would open the bear trap at Rockport for that water to come down to help the raft get through Mock Chunk. Anything else?
One more, why did the LCNN add navigation to its name and not just call itself the Lehigh Canal?
I have no idea. Well, you know, Josiah White had this grand vision that the Lehigh Canal would bring steamboats all the way from the ocean, all the way up to Mock Chunk. And I think he had this image of the way railroads were built across the United States. His image was that they would be canals. And so maybe the navigation sounds more, I don't know, hoity-toity than canal. I don't know. I have no idea.
He owned mines too, right?
Josiah White? You mean, or the LCNN?
The LCNN.
The LCNN, yeah, own mines, yes.
Yeah. So they were more than just a canal.
Oh, yeah. So why they put that in their name? Is that what's the question? Oh, okay, I misunderstood. So originally, they split the company up into a coal company and a navigation company. And that was because they couldn't, when it was combined, they couldn't get enough investors. When they split it, they were able to get enough investors to invest money so they could build both the railroad and the canal. And then once that was done and they incorporated, they consolidated the 2 companies and started calling it, instead of just the Lehigh Coal Company, the Lehigh Navigation Company, the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company. So that's where that came from. Yes, sir.
I think I asked this question, but I'm going to ask it again because I forget. How come we never see pictures of the canal boats going from Easton over to the
Morris Canal.
on how they get across the river?
That's, you know, there's, and I have the same question about things in Mock Chunk, like the Room Run inclined planes at the river, which were really complicated inclined planes. No pictures of that. The Hacklebarney Tunnel and the breaker 2 miles west of Mock Chunk, right on the Switchback Railroad. No photographs of them. And yet they stopped all the way along the way and took pictures of other things. No pictures of that. There's stuff that same thing. I wonder, why was there no pictures taken of that? I have no idea.
I think someone could say there is pictures, but I just never seen.
Oh, okay. I've never seen one. That would be a cool picture to see. Yeah.
Truly, most of the pictures that we have are from the very late days of the canal period.
Right.
And so they stopped using that cable ferry early on in the Lehigh Valley, came over the Delaware and built the chutes. Fort Morris. There was limited use of that cable ferry. You know, and so most of all the pictures we have are not going long after. People didn't have cameras back there to take them to the terminal canals.
There was the same cable ferry down on Lambertville over to
Correct.
New Hope. Right.
Yeah, we were kind of lucky in Jim Thorpe because it was such a tourist town. There was a lot of photographers taking hundreds and hundreds of pictures. Unfortunately, a lot of them are the same thing, and there's significant structures that just were never. At least I've never seen the photographs. I'm hoping someday that they'll show up at a paper show or something that they came out of somebody's attic. But it's a strange thing that we don't have pictures of the Hacklebarney Tunnel. It's weird. Anything else? Thank you very much. Appreciate it.